Welcome back. It's day 3 of the Africa Unlocked 2025 conference, and it has rapidly positioned itself as a platform for business-led dialogue on Africa's future. Now, as global shifts demand immediate African action, Bronwyn Seaborne caught up with Standard Bank Chief Economist Goolam Ballim. They kicked off that conversation unpacking whether the ongoing trade wars were a concern or opportunity for the African continent.
I think the latter, with respect to the potential opportunities that may emerge, is now beginning to surface a little bit more substantially, and for a few reasons. Despite what still is important and substantial in terms of America attempting to reframe global trade rules, the markets have seemingly been sanguine about it. What I mean by that is, if you look at financial markets, it certainly isn't pricing in an enormous amount of uncertainty. Specifically, if we look at what we call financial conditions, which is really access to liquidity as well as its price, conditions have in fact eased, and that's not quite what many would have anticipated. So I'm not going to suggest there's somewhat of a financial markets yawn being shown to America's assailing of the rest of the world. It's important, but it isn't as disturbing as one would have imagined. And of course, what that has meant is it has lowered the tail risk of, say, a recession in the latter half of 2025. And of course, that again is to be cheered because it means that global growth will turn out better than anticipated. I think over the medium term to longer term, this, what we call an arc of opportunity, in a sense that firms hailing from the tip of Africa through the Middle East and into the Far East, this arc will increasingly reinforce itself commercially. In other words, they could turn out to represent firms and countries and regions, maybe even continents, that have a shared value system, that subscribe to a common global framework in terms of the rules of the game, much to the dismay, I'm sure, of the United States. But effectively, we're saying that we're now functioning in a world where over the near to medium term, citizens and statesmen realize that the US has become an unpredictable partner, that the US may not necessarily do justice with regard to fair and reciprocal trade. It's notable also that 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing trade corridors already exclude the United States. And I think America's actions are only going to catalyze that theme.
You talk about catalyzing perhaps or strengthening different bonds. Do you see that the BRICS grouping then looms larger potentially for us and strengthening those bonds more so than perhaps with the US?
So the BRICS grouping, and as we all now know, has evolved into a BRICS Plus. But that said, it is in its nature also evolved over the last 2 decades or so. So its reason for existence, its purpose, the alliances amongst members have similarly evolved. And I think it speaks quite simply to this idea of multipolarity. It speaks to the idea that emerging markets continue to ascend in terms of economic heft, in terms of integration. And so one cannot just simply wish away the increasing dominance, or let's say ascendancy, of the global South. America is not going to deal that a death blow, for that matter. So whatever we refer to it as, BRICS Plus or Global South, the notion of increasing commercial activity and ties between these nations will only strengthen in the years and decades to come. And my sense is that South Africa needs to clearly, and the continent, embrace that. But I would not at the same time discourage that we continue to attempt to enhance economic diplomacy with the United States, with the Europe, both regions. For example, the global North enjoys huge heft. They're meaningful in terms of international diplomacy. And we need to find some common ground, as patchy as it may be, over the near to medium term.
We talk about common ground, and yet AGOA also looms large, and that coming to an end. Does the Africa Continental Free Trade agreement or the area come into play here? Because some would argue that all kind of factors are leading towards just being the really most opportune moment for that agreement to come to the fore and really start working. Are you viewing it like that, or do we just have too far to go on the African Continental Free Trade Area to really make a lot of headway in, so that it's like while AGOA falls away, this area then emerges? I suppose that's probably too simplistic of a solution, but do you see what's currently happening giving impetus to this act, this area, so that Africa starts trading more so with itself than with the rest of the world?
So there's probably two ambitions for Africa with regard to trade. The one is, as you rightly suggest, increasing intra-Africa trade, and the second is for the continent to insert itself into global supply chains, African supply chains as well as international. So those should be the lead motifs with regard to externalizing local economies. The free trade agreement provides us with that platform, that hope, that ambition, and that recognition. But progress has been glacial. And I would hope that given the opportunity, and dare I say the necessity, to reinforce intra-Africa trade, that the economic diplomacy by various nations towards the free trade agreement can only be enhanced. But that said, my sense it's the private sector that needs to lean in. In the same way, over the last 2 decades, intra-Africa trade has doubled from around 9% of total trade, say 20 years ago, to around 18% now. It's grown, it's doubled, but the private sector, I suspect, organically, can be the meaningful source of impetus going forward. The nature of this particular conference is to abet that. In other words, what we're trying to do here is, well, of course, we recognize banks, their vanilla service is to provide and intermediate financial flows between savers and borrowers. But what we also want to do is intermediate relationships amongst entrepreneurs, create an ecosystem of entrepreneurs where we can switch a light on and they get to know each other, they get to see opportunities and engage, and maybe also create an intermediation of ideas, networks of people, and capital is what we're trying to aid in this, what is a Business and Banking Pan-African Congress.
That was Goolam Ballim, Chief Economist for Standard Bank.